Welcome everyone to Sitecore User Group India session. Today we have Nick with us, who works at Sitecore as a product manager for developer experience. Today we will learn about Sitecore headless development using ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK, which has been introduced with the launch of Sitecore 10. So Nick will be presenting on this, and this session basically will focus on the introduction of headless deployment using this SDK, and he will cover few examples which are built on using this approach. And if you have any questions related to this topic, please ask in chat window. We will cover your questions at the end of the session. Now over to you, Nick.
Well, thank you, Kushbu, and thank you to the user group for the opportunity to present to y'all. Let me get my slides up here. So yeah, as she just said, we'll be talking about the ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK. And you'll see some Symposium branding in these slides because this is basically an extended version of the presentation that we did at Symposium. In fact, you guys will get some content that I really hoped to be in there, but that we basically had to cut just because the Symposium session was rather short. So with that, as was mentioned, I'm a product manager for developer experience at Sitecore. So my products include the new Sitecore CLI, the ASP.NET Core SDK that we'll be talking about today. I'm now managing the JavaScript SDKs as well for headless development, what's known as JSS, as well as some elements of our Docker experience, mostly on the developer side. The sort of the creation of the containers and Kubernetes deployment and all that is actually a different product manager. But we will talk about that a little bit today. I've been at Sitecore for 3 years now, but I've been working with the platform in some form or another for actually about 12 years now. First as a solution partner, then as a technology partner with our own plugin for Sitecore, and then, like I said, joining up about 3 years ago. I am in Asheville, North Carolina, USA, which means it's a little early here. It's about 6:30 in the morning. But I got my first cup of coffee in. Just for context, that's about there and a long flight away. I do hope that once we're through this pandemic, I get the chance to visit y'all for a SUGCON India. That's definitely on my bucket list, as both professionally and personally for visiting your country. In this as preparation for this presentation, before we actually get into ASP.NET Core, I took a look at the DevX survey responses for India, which we just closed. The survey we just closed actually. And y'all were the second largest set of responses by country. So thank you for participating in that. So filtering on the responses from India, we can see there's actually quite a large percentage of developers who are new to Sitecore, but also some good, balanced with a good number of you who've been working with the platform for some time. And if you're working on Sitecore, you're doing it a lot. So it's obviously a focus for a lot of people in their careers, which is great to see. Contributions to open source, although obviously you have a lot, not the majority of people don't contribute to open source. That's true across the globe, but yeah, there's actually a higher percentage of you who do contribute to open source. Continuing on, the percentage of y'all applying Helix is also, I think in general, you're combining all projects, some projects, I think about 10 points higher, which again, great to see. Helix does fall into just how satisfied and passionate y'all are about Sitecore in general. The Net Promoter Score for developers in India was actually significantly higher than elsewhere. So all this is to say, really appreciate all the passion and work you guys have around Sitecore, and I'm happy to be here to presenting today. So getting into the content, we'll be going through a few more slides, introducing you to some background and concepts from the rendering SDK, and then we'll get into we'll get out of PowerPoint and go through 3 different examples we have of using it. We have a getting started template that makes it easy for anyone to start up with a simple project. And then we have a couple examples out on GitHub with our Helix examples site implemented in ASP.NET Core, as well as our tech marketing team has begun rebuilding the Sitecore MVP site in ASP.NET Core, and they're doing that open source, which is awesome. So first, let's take a little trip back in time to Sitecore 9.1. And in Sitecore 9.1, we introduced Sitecore JSS. And one of the big innovations of JSS was the separation of layout and rendering. So whereas historically with Sitecore, we have very much a decoupled content architecture under the hood. We did have sort of coupled rendering. So the Sitecore rendering engine was outputting HTML direct from the CMS. You did all your development integrated into integrated into the Sitecore itself. With JSS, we introduced the layout service. And the layout service actually takes your pages and outputs them not as HTML, but as JSON. So it has a JSON tree structure that includes all the placeholders on the page, the components within those placeholders, and as well as associated data sources. And with that, you're able to use our rendering SDKs then to external to Sitecore itself to render that content to markup or to whatever other channel you're looking to output that content to. So those rendering SDKs at first just included JavaScript, React, Vue, and Angular. And they were intended to be sort of lightweight SDKs that could then let you consume that layout service output and again render a JavaScript application. So with Core 10, we introduced another rendering option that was not JavaScript, and that was ASP.NET Core. So our ASP.NET Core SDK uses the same architecture as JSS, consumes the same services. In fact, the module that you need to install to use ASP.NET Core used to be called Sitecore JavaScript Services Server. And now we're still somewhat in the process of renaming that to Sitecore Headless Services. You'll actually see in Sitecore 10.1 that the name of that package will be changing to Sitecore Headless Services. But now we have that server module, and we have basically 2 sets of SDKs, or JavaScript SDKs and our ASP.NET Core SDKs for consuming that. If you're not familiar with ASP.NET Core, you'll see a lot in it that's very similar to ASP.NET, but it is a redesign. It's very fast. It's open source, so you can actually go out and grab the code for ASP.NET Core. You can build and debug it as needed. This has actually come in handy for us a couple times in the development of the SDK and these examples. It's meant to be, the architecture is meant to be modular and testable throughout, so it's much easier to write unit tests and integration tests for your code. It's intended to be cloud and container ready, so Microsoft has a lot of great examples out there for running ASP.NET Core apps on containers in particular. And it is cross-platform. well, today we'll be working on Windows only, and technically our direct support is only for Windows still. It will allow us to more easily extend into Linux as a hosting platform for at least for your rendering part, while we continue to refactor the monolith as well. So included in the ASP.NET Core SDK, we have a client API for interacting with the layout service, which we just described. So there's actually some client libraries that actually can be used independently, even of ASP.NET Core, if you had another use case for accessing the layout service in a structured way. We have the ability to render a Sitecore placeholder as it comes out of the layout service, and to map the components to particular implementations in ASP.NET Core, as we'll see. We have helpers for rendering Sitecore fields, both because those fields might contain structured data versus just text that needs to be output, but as well as to assist with outputting those correctly for use with the experience editor. We have some built-in middleware that helps with mapping a incoming request to the SDK, or rather to what we call the rendering host, to a layout service request. We have the ability to bind data coming from the layout service to strongly typed models. So if you've used tools like Synthesis and Glass, this will seem somewhat familiar, but instead of binding to item data, here we're binding to layout service output. We fully support the experience editor, as does JSS and analytics and personalization as well. And we'll talk about how that works in a second. So let's take a look at what an incoming HTTP request looks like with ASP.NET Core. So things start out as standard ASP.NET Core, and that's one of, I think, the key architectural decisions we made with this SDK, is that we wanted to work within ASP.NET Core. We didn't want to sort of have this Sitecore MVC type situation where we've sort of wrapped the framework. We wanted to work within the framework itself and follow the request process and standard conventions of ASP.NET Core in general. So when a request comes in, your controller and action will be resolved, and typically when using our SDK, you'll have a controller action that has the use Sitecore rendering attribute on it. And what this will do is trigger our middleware, our rendering engine middleware. So middleware, if you've done any work in Node.js or Express, the concept of middleware should be familiar to you. ASP.NET Core uses a similar concept of middleware that basically allows various pieces of code, various modules to affect an incoming HTTP request. So we insert our middleware if you make use of this attribute on your controller action. And what that's going to do is trigger that mapping between the incoming request and a request to the layout service. Typically, it means if you request, say, a URL of /products, that it's then going to result in a layout service request for an item under the site at /products. So that request will be sent through our layout service client to your content delivery instance. And a response will then come back from content delivery to our middleware. And what the middleware will do at that point is just stash that response in what we call the rendering context, and then invoke your MVC action. So just like in regular MVC, that's going to usually result in a razor view being rendered. And from here, what we call tag helpers take over. So tag helpers are sort of like HTML helpers in MVC5, but they have a syntax that's much more HTML-like. So your Razor looks quite a bit cleaner in that way. One of our important tag helpers is the Sitecore placeholder, which functions just like the placeholder you know and love, with a one important addition, and that's that it's going to basically resolve the components that come back in the layout service output. And those components in ASP.NET Core could be partial views, what ASP.NET Core calls view components, which have a backing C# class for doing additional logic. And we also provide what's called model-bound views, which will probably be your most common usage. And that's basically a default view component where you can specify the model that should be available to the Razor view. So in our additions to ASP.NET Core model binding, then you can pull in data from the layout service to a strongly typed model and then output it in your Razor view using our field helper tag, our field rendering tag helpers. Describing this all very conceptually right now, it might be hard to follow. We'll see it in action shortly. Happening within this process, but modeled separately here to keep the diagram understandable, is support for analytics and personalization. So again, that incoming HTTP request is going to ultimately get mapped to a request to the layout service. And as part of that, if you enable tracking support, it's actually going to copy over some headers from that HTTP request. And these are headers that Sitecore and XDB need for for supporting analytics and personalization. So for example, x_forwarded_for is that header is going to include the IP address for GeoIP. It's going to copy any cookie values over, which would include the analytics cookie for identifying contacts and so on. It's going to copy the user agent, which is sometimes used in personalization rules, as well as the referrer, which is also sometimes used in personalization or analytics. And so behind the scenes, this is the same process as for JSS. The layout service will take the item path requested and use it as the URL for analytics. Things will run through the standard Sitecore MVC pipelines, which the layout service uses. And that's how it gets support for all the standard analytics and personalization logic. And then obviously, but then instead the layout service is outputting JSON. And then a similar process is going to happen on the response with the set cookie header. So if, for example, Sitecore needs to initialize that analytics cookie, that's going to get copied from the layout service response to the HTTP response that goes to the browser and the website user. One more diagram. Again, we'll see all this in action, but just want to explain architecturally how things are working here. We'll see that when we invoke the experience editor, that so somehow we need to get markup from this external ASP.NET Core application, right? So what the experience editor actually does is encapsulate the page editing state in a format that matches the layout service. And it's going to send that in an HTTP post to your rendering host. And we have middleware you can enable in the rendering host to turn this on. And what that middleware will do is actually rewrite the request to look like a standard GET request to one of your controller action. And all the standard request handling then kicks in that we saw in that first diagram, which will then output some HTML. There's then a little bit more work that needs to happen because the experience editor is actually the URL where all that markup will be rendered. And there may be things like JavaScript files, CSS files that will be output at relative URLs. And so we actually do some additional work there to rewrite those URLs so that the browser will request them directly from your rendering host. So all that is to say is that your CM instance actually needs to be able to do an HTTP post to your rendering host, and that is part of the reason why you'll see the containers set up the way they are in our a lot of our examples. So let's get into that first example, and that is our getting started template. So, and this is actually gives you a full Visual Studio solution, containerized with some starter items, and as well as an ASP.NET Core rendering host. And you can install this template yourself with the .NET Core command line. So, and this URL is out on the doc site. So you only need to install once, and then you can create as many instances, projects as you like using the .NET New command. And you do need .NET Core 3.1, .NET Framework 4.8. Visual Studio 2019 is needed for some of the build pieces. You'll see me working in both VS Code and Visual Studio today. And then you will need Docker for Windows with Windows containers enabled. So let's get into it. So again, out on the doc site, you'll see the command to install the template. So, and since that has our mygit URL in it, that's someone is sometimes easier to just copy and paste. And let's see here. Let's see if we can increase the font size a little bit here. Here we go. There we go. All right, just to jump back here for a second, we'll see after doing that install that we now have the Sitecore ASP.NET getting started template available. If you haven't used .NET New templates before, they're kind of like Visual Studio templates. They can give you solutions or projects or even individual files, and they're all actually deployed or distributed and installed through NuGet, which makes it convenient. And so let's go back here and we'll do .NET New, the name of the .NET New template, and we'll do plugin. Again, going to create us a full Visual Studio solution. It's going to ask us if we want to do a .NET tool restore. We want to say yes, because this is gives us the Sitecore CLI, which will be used to deploy some items. And now we can go into this solution and let's open up Visual Studio Code. And we'll see what we get here. So again, there's a Visual Studio solution. We see there's a README. There's a source folder that contains some items using the new Sitecore serialization, a project for deploying to platform or to CMCD, a project for running for a rendering host. We have a Docker environment here, which follows a lot of the conventions that we've and recommended practices we've outlined in the new containers DevX documentation that came with Sitecore 10. Those Docker files for things like the rendering host. And when I say rendering host, I don't know if I've introduced that term explicitly or not, but rendering host is what we call the application that you build with the ASP.NET Core SDK. But looking at the README, it's going to give you some additional steps here, and including if you have IIS running, you're going to want to stop that, like when you do like with any Sitecore container development. And it tells you some other steps you need to do, but in the end, all these steps can be done for you if you just run the init script. So let's do that. We want to initialize the environment file. We want to give it our Sitecore license and an admin password. Don't worry about this error. It happens since I have a internal PowerShell gallery set up as well here. And now if we look at our Docker environment file, we'll see it's initialized it with things like a SQL SA password for us, the path to my Sitecore license, and as well as put some random values into some various keys and secrets that are needed. So now there's also this up script that I can go ahead and execute. And we'll see it's going to do things like build the containers, start up the Sitecore environment, log into the Sitecore environment using the Sitecore CLI, push some items, publish them, and eventually it'll actually open our browser for us even. So let's go ahead and run that. This may take a minute, so while that goes, we'll talk about a few things. First off, if you run into any issues with containers here, strongly encourage you to visit the troubleshooting section of our containers documentation. It goes through a lot of common issues and debugging steps, like looking at the Docker logs, how to deal with memory issues. We do recommend 32 gigs of memory for an XP0 environment. Common issues around when your Windows containers not being able to access the internet or files being in use. The message Docker gives when a port is in use is not that friendly. It will say it can't access the file, even though it's talking about a port. It usually means you need to shut down IIS or something else. Common issues that we run into when you see Box, when you might be using Box Drive or other such tools. So Docker for Windows can be a little finicky, and the first time getting up and running can sometimes feel a little frustrating. But once you have things working, it's usually pretty smooth, and it is I think a pretty revolutionary change to Sitecore development. And you don't need to be using containers in production to use them in development. You can use containers locally and get all the advantages of being able to onboard developers quickly and do upgrades quickly and so on, and then just still output your standard artifacts for production. So looking some more into the solution while it starts up, we'll see in our rendering host in particular, the startup CS is standard for ASP.NET Core. And it's going to do some things like initialize a configuration object, which is Sitecore options, something that we create that's part of this example. It's going to initialize some standard ASP.NET services, including MVC and localization. It's going to add Newtonsoft JSON for model binding with MVC. There are some limitations in system text JSON that make us depend on Newtonsoft. And then it's going to initialize the services for that layout service client. So including some default options that are going to pass to layout service requests, our site name and an API key. And then we'll initialize the services for that rendering engine middleware. Part of that process is registering components, which we'll do create another component in a moment here, enabling that tracking support and copying those headers that we talked about, enabling the experience editor, again, as we talked about earlier. Some other important pieces. So now the configure method in ASP.NET Core is it actually configures middleware and what runs during an HTTP request. Some important things here. We actually enable that endpoint. Let's see what's happened down here. I see an error. The first thing I'm going to do is I usually use VS Code to take a look at my Docker environment, and we'll see what happened here. We see all the containers have started up except traffic, and traffic is our reverse proxy that we include in the Docker environment. And so we can take a look at the traffic logs. It may have just had a problem starting up. It doesn't look like there's anything in particular in the logs. So let's just try Docker compose up -d to see if traffic will start for us this time. Looks like it's good. We'll get back to that in a second, but let's finish talking about this middleware. So let's see here. We actually enable that post endpoint here for the experience editor. We turn on ASP.NET Core routing. We enable ASP.NET Core localization. And the SDK does include some additions that allow you to enable ASP.NET Core localization based on the standard Sitecore language prefix and query string. And then we configure our endpoints. And you can think of endpoints like routes in Sitecore MVC. In fact, that's what in standard MVC. And here that's what we're actually doing is configuring a standard Sitecore route for our default controller and the index action. And this will map it based on that, again, that standard Sitecore URL pattern with the language prefix. And then we can also fall back to languageless routing as well. And this is kind of a built-in MVC endpoint configuration method. So looking at our controller then, that default controller with the index action that we just saw configured. See, we have that use Sitecore rendering attribute that was mentioned earlier that will trigger our middleware. And we also have a page model, which is our own custom model here that will give us some fields from the context item. A title and a banner image, and then just a custom additional property on that model. Have some error handling, but ultimately it's just going to return a view. And as we know from standard MVC, it should mean that it's going to give us index.cshtml. Look under views, default controller, we see index.cshtml. And in this view, we do output some values from that model, including settings, a title for the page and the view data, but we also see a Sitecore placeholder. So let's get things fired up and we can dig into that more. Since our script didn't run all the way through, what we will do is grab a couple pieces from it, including the login to the Sitecore instance. Sitecore content serialization does use with the Sitecore CLI does actually log you in from the command line. You can also do this with Sitecore for Visual Studio. If we log in, we're going to see it's going to say that, hey, are we authorizing for this device code? So this is actually OAuth device code flow, which is similar to what you might use with smart TV apps like Netflix. We'll say yes, we want to allow. And go back, should see login is complete. And we can actually see in the Sitecore folder here, there's now we have this endpoint configured with an OAuth access token. Don't normally need to touch that, but it shows you we have the authentication available there. So now we can do .NET Sitecore serialization push. And we'll see it's going to push a bunch of items for us. And let's take a look at that. Oh, and one more step, .NET Sitecore publish. So in the next version of the CLI, we'll actually have an option to automatically auto-publish items that you sync. For now, this is just doing a full site smart publish. So let's take a look at in Sitecore at what we have. And simultaneously, you should be able to pull up. Oops. So here's our site running in containers on localhost. Looks pretty familiar, but this is not, in fact, the built-in Sitecore homepage. You can tell because we have the updated logo. And we have the name of our project here too. Over in the CM instance, you'll see we have a site here with a homepage and a data source item. So this version of that default standard Sitecore homepage actually uses data sources. And in our templates, we'll see we have a template for the page and that content block. But the place you're going to see the most difference is from your standard MVC development is actually in the layout and renderings. See, our layout actually inherits from what's called a JSS layout. This value is always going to be static. With the JSS layout, we never want to change that because it's really just being output to JSON. And we'll see we have our placeholders configured here explicitly. So that when you're using the layout service with JSS or ASP.NET Core, that's a big difference, is that you do need to configure the placeholders that are on a layout or a rendering, so the layout service knows what placeholders to traverse. Our one rendering in this getting started project is a JSON rendering. And JSON renderings basically just output to JSON. They by default will serialize their data source item. You can configure what's called a rendering contents resolver. So that either one of the built-in ones or a custom one to affect that output. So it can do more than just a data source item if you like. Well, we should have some time to take a look at one of those. And then if this rendering had any nested placeholders, we'd have those configured here as well. So if we take a look at the logs for, oops. That rendering host. Watching the logs for the rendering host is a great idea if as you're working, so you can just do docker compose logs rendering -f. But here we can actually see the output of the layout service for this page. Shows us that we have that route, the banner value, and the placeholders with that content block component. So let's first warm up the experience editor. And while that warms up, we're going to start building a new component. And so first off, let's go ahead and create the rendering. And of course, it doesn't like me doing that while the experience editor is warming up. So we're going to actually probably create a template first with a few fields we want to render. And then we'll create a JSON rendering and then we'll implement it in the rendering host. Come on, experience editor. Since we're probably not going to have time to go through them outright, I can show quickly that out on our Helix examples, we have a more robust example for ASP.NET Core, which actually follows Helix conventions and shows you how you can, say, implement a group of renderings in a Helix module, and also work in cases where you need code both in the platform and in a rendering host. Use those side by side in a Helix module, as well as configure Sitecore content serialization. The MVP site is built out in a similar way, shows has some additional examples of building out renderings in ASP.NET Core. But I think the big addition there is actually Azure pipelines for building out the Docker images and deploying them to pushing them to an Azure container registry, as well as then deploying them to Azure Kubernetes. So big thanks to the tech marketing team for making those available. And those are both available on the Sitecore GitHub. Again, Helix examples, as well as MVP site. So now that that's available, we see this popping up in the experience editor. I have a little issue with the image that sometimes happens. There we go, we just had to flush a cache. So let's add another component here. And for that component, we're going to need a data source. And let's just do my text and my date, just in interest of time. Make this guy a rich text and this a date. On our demo component, we'll set the data source location to just a quick child of the page, and insert a link to that. And now lastly, we need to make sure that we can add that component to our placeholder. So add it as an allowed control here. So this is all seems pretty standard. It's pretty much like standard Sitecore MVC. Add that component and should now ask me to create a data source for it. And we'll call that demo as well. Oh, now we get this message unknown component. So what's this? So because our rendering code is trying to map the name of this component to an implementation and doesn't have it, we get actually the default, what's configured as the default component. And if we look back in our startup code here, we see add default partial view component not found. And under our views, we should see shared component not found. And oh, unknown component. So that's where that message is coming from, and that tells us we have to actually implement this component. So to do a simple component like this, I'm actually going to create it under this Sitecore component folder here, demo. And I need a, actually first I need a model. So let's pop this open in Visual Studio quick. A little easier to read here, especially given my VS Code theme. Ooh. I crashed Visual Studio. So in the interest of time, let's see if I can do this quick and just add. So in my model, I'm going to use a rich text field, which is a built-in class we have for outputting rich text. We have a number of those type field classes for various Sitecore field types. And we want to make sure it matches the name of the field in the template. And in my demo, I can now say model demo, and I can do a paragraph with ASP4, which is a ASP.NET MVC convention for tag helpers, and I can just say my text. So note the autocomplete there. Make sure this is not a self-closing tag so that there's a place for the content to go. And then in my startup now, I just need to register that with the name of the model class and the name of the view. Now, theoretically, if if things are going well for me, I can see that that should actually, yeah. So we use .NET Watch, and you can, it actually sees that I made a change to that class and will automatically recompile it for me. And if all goes well now, back in the experience editor. Yes, so now we have our rich text field where I can do hello world. And I could publish and see it on the front end too, but in the interest of time, I want to continue on and do one more slide and leave maybe a minute for questions here. So you see the basic process for implementing a simple component. Our documentation is pretty thorough tells you how to get started with the template, how to create a simple rendering with a data source like we just did, how to do some more complex scenarios as well, including rendering contents resolvers, creating a language switcher, creating a custom view component, and more. So one more quick slide. So ASP.NET Core rendering, obviously brand new, adds to a lot of existing rendering options. So when would you use it? I'd say first off, projects where you would normally use vanilla Sitecore MVC without SXA. So maybe you don't benefit from the SXA features or workflow, or you have a heavily customized front end or business logic, so you don't want to use the SXA component library. You can actually use an SXA headless tenant with ASP.NET Core like you can with JSS, and I would encourage you to do so. Partial views are great. SXA site management is great. If there are projects where you would have used JSS to get that headless architecture, but don't need the rich front end SPA experience, or maybe you aren't a JavaScript expert, ASP.NET Core might be a good option. Or existing ASP.NET Core sites and applications where you just want to sort of sprinkle in some Sitecore, add Sitecore routes to them. That's a great, this is a great option there. So note there are some limitations still that were, as this is a sort of a brand new option. We don't have support yet for Sitecore forms in particular. Authentication is going to be more work than with Sitecore MVC, but we actually, Rob Earlham from Tech Marketing has an example of that coming out soon. So thank you all. Sorry we didn't get to go in deep to all the examples, and I didn't leave much time for questions. But if you guys can hang around, then I can, and I'm happy to take those questions.
Yeah. So we have got one question. That is, do we really need to set up the Docker for Sitecore ASP.NET Core development? If not, can you please explain for the standalone development practice too?
Sure. So I'd say if you don't want to use Docker, you can certainly spin up a local Sitecore environment. You install what's the Sitecore Headless Services module. You install Sitecore Management Services. And at that point, you can use the same getting started template, but you'd be just working against a local instance instead of against the Dockerized instance. And one thing actually I didn't get a chance to show is that, even though I was using the rendering host in a Docker container, you can start it up directly from Visual Studio as well and debug that way, or you can attach to that one to the containerized one to debug. Yeah, and maybe that's a good candidate for a follow-up video or blog article.
Yeah, there is one more. There is no additional rendering added to Sitecore rendering type for .NET Core rendering. We are using the same JSON rendering. Then why we are calling it .NET Core rendering?
So the word rendering is a little loaded in the Sitecore space, and obviously it's a question of what you're rendering, right? So with the JSON rendering, you are rendering the data to JSON, but when we call it the rendering SDK, that's about HTML rendering. So admittedly, there's some maybe confusing semantics there around creating a rendering in JSON that outputs JSON and then rendering to HTML, I guess is the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No, nothing so far. Yeah. So, thank you, Nick, for this such an informative session, and thank you all for joining. Also, apologies for the inconvenience caused due to fake entries, and we will make sure that this does not happen again. And we will continue to arrange this sessions. So keep joining, keep motivating us, and keep learning with us regarding Sitecore and the topics. Yeah.
Thank you all. Seems like a great user group. Keep up the good work.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
Cheers.